Good evening, AP Euro scholars, and welcome back to another exciting screencast from yours truly, Mr. Corrigan. I hope this finds you well. Now that we've wrapped up World War I, it's time to look at the post-World War I world. But first we have to create a peace treaty, and that is not always easy. World War I ends, and the Great War, as it was referred to then, was the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. European powers, whose populations are decimated, whose homelands are devastated, come together along with representatives from their colonial holdings as well as the United States and their allies abroad, and meet in Paris in 1919. To hash out a peace. However, they arrive with wildly differing worldviews and vastly different ideas for what their respective countries need and what the world needs as a result of this devastating conflict. And when you have that many people who are on the same side but not on the same page, things can get messy. So let's take a look at the mess that is Paris in 1919. In January 1919, a couple months after the war ends, you remember that the war ends with an armistice on November 11th, 1918. That is a date that all knowledgeable AP European history students must know. And it takes a couple of months for everyone to then gather in Paris because travel as it was then is not nearly as quick or as efficient as it is now. In addition, Woodrow Wilson, who we will talk about in just a second, goes on a speaking tour of Europe before he finally settles down in Paris to hash out this peace agreement. And he was wildly celebrated by all the people who greeted him on his arrival in these European countries. He's the man that won the war, though that may be a bit exaggerated, as you know. Though the Paris Peace Conference involved over 70 delegates from 27 nations and representatives from all over the world, the proceedings are dominated by the Big Four, or what your book calls the Big Three, plus Italy, the other most prominent ally, shown here. The leaders of those four nations have very different ideas of what should be done with Germany, what should be done with Germany's colonies, and what the world should look like now that war is over. Let's take a look at who these guys are. From left to right, we have David Lloyd George, the man with three first names and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando, the President of Italy, Georges Clemenceau, the old walrus, the president of France, and of course Woodrow Wilson, dominating figure of these proceedings. We're going to look at Woodrow Wilson first and foremost. He's the most widely celebrated and debated figure from the Paris Peace Conference. Now, while David Lloyd George and Georges Clemenceau had much more traditional ways of dealing with Germany in the post-war world, they want reparations, they want lands, they want assurances that this isn't going to happen again. Woodrow Wilson wants to take those traditional ways of dealing with losers in war, throw them out the window, and go in a completely different direction. And he has a plan for what that different direction is going to be, and his map is the 14 points. He believed that the Great War, as it was called at the time, was caused by secret negotiations, secret treaties. And so he made calls for open diplomacy. More from his selections of his 14 points were freedom of commerce, believing that free trade was going to lead to economic dependency, and that was a good thing. That was going to mean that fewer countries are going to war with one another if they rely on each other for materials and money. If everyone's trading with one another, everyone's profiting from these kinds of industrial and economic conditions, then what's the point of going to war? He wanted freedom of the seas, lest we forget the sinking of the Lusitania, lest we forget thousands of ships that were sunk as a result of German U-boats and naval warfare and the British blockade, the starving people of Germany at the end of the war, and even into January and February and March of 1919 as the blockade continued. Freedom of the seas goes hand in hand with freedom of commerce, allowing people to travel across the globe to bring their wares, to bring their goods, their products to open markets. He also stresses national self-determination. And this goes with the nationalism of the 19th century, that individual peoples, nations, ethnic groups sought to align their ethnic concentrations with national borders, that people would have governments through democratic majority rule elections. They would live free from outside interference in territories with clearly defined permanent borders that would align more or less with where these people live. So if you're Czech, you'll carve out your own Czech nation. If you're Serbian, you'll carve out your own Serbian nation. It would mean an end to multi-ethnic empires. But of course, that always gets a little bit tricky and messy, because where do we draw these lines? He wanted a reduction of arms and militaries, because he believed that if you don't have artillery, you don't have guns, you don't have arms, you're not going to go to war with one another. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you build up arms in some sort of arms race, then you're much more likely to want to justify the expenditure and go to war. And finally, he called for a League of Nations, and this was his baby. This was his prize point in the selection of 14 points, is he wanted the world to get along. And this was ultimately the key piece in preventing future wars, is keeping open lines of diplomacy so that people could negotiate and compromise and talk about their problems rather than going to war. Rather than using brinkmanship or the threat of war and actual conflict, let's use diplomacy and let's use compromise and negotiation to prevent this terrible, terrible tragedy from happening again. Because modern warfare, as we've seen in World War I, is tremendously destructive, not just to the people fighting, but to the people who are caught in the crossfire. And so why don't we create conditions where that can be prevented? As I mentioned, there were many problems with the peace from the get-go. George Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, Vittorio Orlando, were much more concerned with acquiring territory and making Germany pay reparations. Clemenceau wanted to punish Germany so this German state in the center of Europe would not be a behemoth, would not invade France ever again. There were further problems as well. So many of the representatives from colonial powers never got a chance to speak. One significant person who was in attendance that day was a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who will lead the Vietnamese revolution and independence movement in the 1950s and 60s and 70s against the French and United States. He had been educated abroad. He was in Paris. He served as a representative at these proceedings, and he never got a voice for Vietnamese independence or Vietnamese national self-determination. One of the hypocrisies of the Versailles peace proceedings, the idealism of Wilson really only applied to Europeans. It really only applied to those who were Western and not to their colonial counterparts. In addition, Germany didn't have much in the way of chance to negotiate. In fact, as we said before, the British Empire is maintaining its blockade on Germany. The new government that's formed, the Weimar Republic, is forced to accept the peace terms, as you see in this political cartoon here. The Big Four says, here's what we got. It took us 6 months. We've negotiated a peace settlement, a one-sided peace agreement, and you gotta take your medicine. You don't get much of a choice because your people are starving and there's really no alternative. It's this or back to war, and nobody wants war. There's some harsh terms here too. It's a treaty that's signed significantly on June 28, 1919, 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And that's not lost on the people who are there. Right away, Germany is forced to pay $5 billion, or the equivalent of $5 billion, and then $32 billion more over the next 30 years. Their army is reduced to 100,000 men. They are not allowed to have U-boats. They're not allowed to have an air force. They can have no heavy artillery. It's basically a police force. They have to return Alsace-Lorraine to France, territory that had been in their possession since 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War. The Rhineland and the Saarland, two territories along the French-German border, would serve as buffer zones occupied by the League of Nations and by France. Belgium got land, Poland got land. The Polish people get a newly independent Poland in 1919 for the first time in a heck of a long time. And Poland needed access to the sea. So they get the Polish corridor, which is going to become a sticking point in the side of the Germans because it carved Germany into two pieces, splitting East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Germany's overseas possessions became mandates. This is also going to be the case with the Ottoman Empire. Much of their empire is going to be carved up. As we'll see, the British and the French and the Japanese take over a lot of these overseas colonies. They become mandates. Mandates are supposed to be on the path to full independence. But of course, the British and the French have no incentive whatsoever to make that a reality. The British and the French can treat these as colonies of their own and just say, well, yeah, they're not quite ready for independence yet, but maybe someday down the line. One of the things that it really was a sticking point for Germany too was the war guilt clause, and this forced Germany to take full responsibility for the war. And as we've seen, it was rather nebulous who's at fault for the war, but this is insult added to injury after having to pay money and give up land, and this is going to lead to some very unhappy Germans, as we will see. Many Germans believed the wartime propaganda that repeatedly claimed Germany was an innocent victim, forced into war by a circle of barbaric enemies. When presented with these new terms, the new German government, the Weimar Republic, protested vigorously, but again, they have no choice. They have this or war, and nobody wants war. One of the big downsides of this peace settlement that comes out of Paris in 1919 is that the League of Nations gets adopted, but never really comes to full fruition. And a big part of that has to do with the fact that the United States never approves the Treaty of Versailles. And the big sticking point there was something called Article 10. Article X, obviously, in Roman numerals. Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations is the section calling for assistance to be given to a member state that experiences external aggression, meaning one of the states in the League of Nations is invaded. When that happens, Britain and France and the United States, who are called the major peacemakers, the Allied forces, were required to get involved on the side of the victim nation. Well, this causes alarm bells back in the United States, and the treaty is brought back by Wilson to be debated and approved by, ultimately, hopefully, approved by the U.S. Senate, because it's the U.S. Senate that ultimately has veto power over any kind of peace treaty, foreign treaties. It's not the president, he's the chief diplomat, but it has to be approved by the Senate. Well, the Senate was dominated by this guy, Henry Cabot Lodge. And Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican senator from Massachusetts who was Wilson's mortal enemy. As far left as Wilson was on the political spectrum, Henry Cabot Lodge was equally as far right on the political spectrum. He was a conservative, he was a realist, and he had huge qualms about the United States' role in the world after World War I. He thought that Article 10 took away the sovereignty of the United States, that the U.S. Senate was the body that decided when and where the United States got involved in war, and not the League of Nations, and not that they should be required to get involved in war whenever it should happen. Again, these are old world problems. We're in the new world. You're lucky we got involved in World War I at all. So he thought that this was going to cause the United States to be entangled in foreign wars everywhere and anywhere for the foreseeable future, and that the United States' hands would be tied. We've got our own issues to worry about. And his bigger concern was the prosperity of the United States, which at this point was growing, but in no way, shape, or form was guaranteed to continue growing at such a rate. As a result, the League of Nations is rejected. Just like we see in this political cartoon, we have the dove offering the olive branch of peace, the League of Nations, and the senator saying, take it away, how dare you, this is a horrible vulture, it's going to destroy us. So ultimately, the League of Nations, which showed so much promise and gave so many people hope in the aftermath of World War I will prove over the next decade and a half, to be missing something, missing the keystone. The keystone is what holds the bridge together. Of course, the United States, which emerged from World War I as the most prosperous nation, due in part to not having any fighting done on its soil, due to the finances of World War I and a lot of the money shifting from London to New York. The United States needed to be involved in this League of Nations to give it any chance of survival, to give it any chance of success. And of course, the United States is not involved. The United States turns inward, becomes very isolationist after World War I, and we will not get involved in foreign entanglements for the most part until World War II. And even then, we're not chomping at the bit. It's going to take a push and a shove to get the United States riled up once again. So we conclude by saying that despite high hopes after the end of the war, the trauma of World War I was not conclusively decided in Paris in 1919. Major issues remain unresolved, and more unforeseen consequences loomed on the horizon, as you probably know. We are 20 years away from World War II. And some of those problems, namely World War II, and in the meantime, the Great Depression, are going to be created in part, sometimes in large part, by the Versailles Peace. Some historians believe that the years from 1914 to 1945 might more accurately be labeled as a modern 30 Years' War, because World War I will bleed right into World War II. And the problems unleashed in August of 1914 were really only resolved in the 1950s. As much as they like to put a stamp on the Treaty of Versailles and wrap everything up nicely in a bow, that's not the case. This strong assertion contains a great deal of truth. For all of Europe, World War I was a revolutionary conflict of gigantic proportions with lasting traumatic effects. Thanks for listening. We'll pick up next time with Chapter 26. Thank you, and we'll see you then.